the survival archetypes are there to help you survive, but not thrive, right? So a lot of times when we're playing out the survival archetypes, we're doing what we think we have to do to stay alive, either literally or metaphorically. But a lot of times that's usually at the expense of our own health, at the expense of our own freedom, at the expense of our own empowerment. And these archetypal forces are really instilled very early on in our life. Usually by the time we're 7 to 10 years old, we've encountered the victim archetype. We've encountered a situation in which we had to self-sabotage for our own safety. There was a time in which we had to prostitute ourselves for our own security. So these are very deep formative forces that formed at a very early age. A lot of them can be learned patterns too, from parents, teachers, kind of things that you observe. But they're really situations in which, as a child, you felt somewhat threatened. And there was a moment in time where you said, I have to give my power away in order for me to survive this situation. Whether it's you feeling victimized for some reason, you feeling attacked for some reason, and you say, okay, I need to do this to ensure my own survival. But the issue that you run into is that may have served you in that moment, but in that moment you created what we were saying earlier, a contract with that archetype, which is a pattern that you continue to play out over and over again over the course of your journey until it creates enough pain in your life that you have to reassess it. That's where your teaching of the pain teacher comes into play. And a lot of times the pain teacher arrives when you've played out the disempowered or shadow expression of the archetype enough times that your body, your soul, this feedback mechanism is saying to you, all right, Greg, it's time for you to reassess this contract. Do you want to continue to play the victim to get your emotional needs met? Do you want to continue to sabotage yourself out of the fear of getting attacked? Do you want to continue to prostitute yourself just to ensure some guaranteed outcome or someone's approval? And a lot of the pain in our life is when we're being called to renegotiate that contract. So the 4 survival archetypes are the child, the victim, the saboteur, and the prostitute. And we'll get into each one in more depth individually. But the way I like to almost explain it is a lot of these archetypes are almost like your inner child survival team. Each archetype is kind of like playing a certain role to ensure the child archetype's survival, the child archetype's security, safety, and what it feels like it has to do to get some sort of connection, love, or emotional need met. So those are really the ways in which they show up. And the healing process is really just our relationship with upgrading and renegotiating some of the old ways which brought us safety and security, but obviously at the expense of freedom, health, vitality, and empowerment.
I think you have a slightly different approach than I do in the survival archetypes with a child, because I have the child in the core archetypes, because we are always born with a father and a mother, and we're the child. So when I use the concept of survival archetypes, I orient towards the negative expressions such as eternal child, nature child, wounded child, abandoned child, only because my system already has the child in at the core level. But so, I know you understand the derivations of the child. So which would you like to start with and take us through these 4? You want to start with the child?
Yeah, we'll start with the child. And before I get into that, it's important to understand that all archetypes have light and shadow. So there's no archetype that's just light, and there's no archetype that's just shadow. They all have that balance of light and shadow. So as we go through it, we'll kind of identify both sides of the coin. So the child archetype, the light side of the child is our playfulness, our youthfulness, our beginner's minds. The child has deep curiosity. The child is able to see everything as a new novel experience and is very present. The child also is very creative and holds a lot of the gifts that we're here to bring forth. So the inner child is really an important thing that we all stay connected to, because it's the source of creativity and curiosity, and playfulness. But where we get into trouble with the shadow side is where the child archetype has patterns of learned helplessness and powerlessness and outsourcing self-responsibility, outsourcing the power of choice, looking for some mother or father authority figure to take care of us. So the child archetype in the shadow expression is when we're staying a child and we're projecting responsibility, power, and choice outside of us.
Which is coupled with neediness. When you're in a relationship of any type as an adult with someone who's still acting out the child, there's always a level of neediness where they are not self-empowered. They're always wanting someone else to solve their problems or rescue them or feed them or protect them. So if you get stuck in the child archetype when you should be an adult, it becomes very challenging to navigate relationships with adults, because the effect that it has on the adult is they don't have a co-contributor or co-creator, they have a codependent. And this is why, for example, in all rites of passage ceremonies, they had to completely get you out of the child archetype to become capable of protecting the tribe, feeding the tribe, and being an adult, because there's not an infinite supply of resources out there. So you can only feed so many children before you have a deficit in the balance of how much consumption there is by children and how much work has to be done by adults to maintain the balance of life. So what's happened in our culture is that we've, as you're very aware, we have so many people that should be adult contributors to society and to culture and to the world that are still living in the child archetype, that they're staying codependent upon others around them. And this leads to, for example, an exorbitant misuse of social services or of welfare. And so it can become so extremely costly for corporations and governments and organizations and companies to pay all these insurances and have so many claims against them that we actually disable ourselves as individuals, and we disable our companies, and we disable sports teams, and we disable relationships, because there's a certain point at which the child archetype has to transition, in my system, into a warrior, into somebody who has a set of values and is clear on what they're willing to live for and willing to die for, or you end up just with a whole bunch of children, which makes you very susceptible to the dangers of parental figures that have their own ideas about what they want to do with you. And oftentimes those can be very conflicting and very painful when you realize that some of these ideas are not often grounded in love or nurture or care or concern, but profitability and manipulation and serving the greed of whoever the father figure or mother figure turns out to be, which, you know, an example is the president or the prime minister of a country or the leader of a religion or of a cult or any number of things. And so, you know, I would just say that as you hear this discussion of the child archetype, it's not just for children that are children, it's adults that are still being children. And it's one of the most disabling things we have happening in the world at this very moment.
Yeah. And there's different variations, like you were saying, of the child archetype that some people might connect to and help them understand their own specific patterning. For example, the eternal child. Like you've talked a lot about the eternal child, which the light side of the eternal child is actually kind of staying young in spirit and young in heart and always staying connected to your childlike nature. But there's a difference between being childlike and childish. You know, the eternal child is childish when it expresses in the shadow. There's the magical child that can see the beauty and potential in everything, but also is not rooted in reality. So it has these fantasy ideas and it doesn't really understand the process that one must go through, or something like hard work. You know, it thinks money grows on trees and things like that. So there's all these different variations of the child, the orphan child that feels abandoned but is very independent, or the adult child that loses connection to its childhood and its childlike nature because it had to develop a lot of adult responsibilities as a child. So learning some of these different variations, which I share in the course, will allow you to deeper connect with what your own unique child archetype signature is, which then you can see how it might be playing out in the rest of your life today. Like you said, even if you're an adult.